Hi, Greg Hughes again from 90-Second Website Builder. It's time to talk about the Layer tool, another tool that's going to make your life easier and better as you're building websites with 90-Second Website Builder. The Layer tool is important. It's something that you're going to want to use a lot. In fact, it's under the advanced section of the toolbox, not because it's difficult to use, but because what it accomplishes behind the scenes is rather advanced. In this video, I'm just going to talk about a basic layer. The layer has a lot of attributes and properties that can't be covered in one video tutorial. So I'm just going to show you an overview of the layer tool. And then in other videos, we will cover some specific tricks and tips and techniques that you can do with layers, different modes and whatnot. I'm under the advanced toolbox section. I'm going to click on layer and just draw a box. I'm literally drawing a layer of the size that I want here. A layer is just, in simple terms, a container for putting objects in. Now, at first, you might think that doesn't sound really important because you can drag and drop objects onto the canvas anywhere you want to, which is basically true. But a layer contains objects and can control them with its own attributes, as you will see as we move along. I've just made a very basic, plain-looking layer here with nothing in it. If we double-click on it, you can see we can open up the object properties. One of the most obvious things you'll want to do is change the look of the layer. A layer can have its own style, which means it can have a background, it can have borders. That background can be solid colors, it can be gradients, it can be images. There's a lot of things you can do to a layer, much like you could do to the page itself. A layer is very similar in that it has a lot of possibilities. It can have shadows. It can be associated with events that are triggered, animations, and a layer even be used as a form. So as you can see, the layer tool itself is so robust, we're going to kind of have to take this a piece at a time just to cover what it does. What I'm going to do is just drag some objects into this layer. I've got an image here. Some of this image is white, and so you're not seeing any of it yet because the background of my layer is white. And then I've got a couple of other images here we'll put right here, and then some text. I do this to demonstrate a couple of things. You'll notice that when I drug objects into the layer, it highlighted. So this image right here is now outside of the layer. It's still outside of the layer and won't be inside the layer until we actually see this highlight right here. So there's a blue line telling us we've made it into the layer. This is important because sometimes if your object is just 1 pixel outside of the layer like this, it's no longer part of the layer. It has to be all the way in, and this will play out to be an important technique you'll want to remember. Also, like I said, you can't see all of this because it's white on white, so let's change the color of this layer. I'm going to double click on it, open up the object properties, go to style, and let's change the solid color to something dark. There we go. Something a lot darker, and now you can see everything in here. Again, it's a container, and so everything moves with the layer and sort of becomes one, and yet these objects are also independent and can be moved around inside the layer. An important concept also to know when we get to the idea of creating responsive websites. Layers will play a really important part of making your site responsive. Let me show you one of the basic tricks that I like to do with a layer, and then I'm going to show you some examples of how I use them. So right now, if I click F5 and just preview the page, all we've done is we've placed a layer on the page and put objects in it. It doesn't really do much at this point because it's just a plain box with objects in it. But what I like to do is I like to make my layers relative. Here's what that means. When I double click on this layer, I'm going to go to the attributes here under relative horizontal sizing, and I'm going to check that box. I also like my layers to have an alignment of center, so that the objects will center in the browser page inside the layer, no matter what size the browser window is. And this will make more sense, again, as you see it in action, more than just hearing me explain it. And then the other thing I'm going to do, and this is critical, I'm going to make the layer be the exact width of my page. The page I'm working on right now, this page has a size of 1200. I'm going to move the camera over so you can see the edge of my ruler. And you'll notice right here, my page ends at 1200. Another way for you to see this is if I right click and go to page properties, you can see that the page width is in fact 1200. That's an important number for me to know as I'm working with this layer because I want this layer to be relative horizontal sizing. Here's what that means. If I change the width of this layer, and I can do this by simply dragging it and pulling it over to 1200, then it's capable of creating an infinite background. And by the way, if you're uncomfortable dragging that and stretching it to 1200, another way to do it is to select the layer and then go down, remember, to our properties palette, and we could set the size of the layer right here. Remember, we're working with the properties of this layer, and I could change the size here simply by typing this in. So anyway, I now have a layer that's 1200 pixels wide exactly, the exact matching width of my page. It's important that it's all the way over starting at pixel 0, and it's relative horizontal sizing. Here's what that means. If we click F5, what happens is I have a section of my website, this layer, that will be the proper width no matter how wide the browser window gets stretched. This is called an infinite width or a repeating X width. So no matter how wide I make this browser window, that will fill the browser window infinitely. And that's what relative horizontal sizing means. You can do it vertically too, but that's not as common. We're usually making headers and footers and things like that, content areas that we want to be relative. And so that's one of the most important and basic uses of the layer. You'll also notice that the content is shifting as I move the browser window. I'm going to come in here and get more into the camera here. You can see that the content shifts. That's because I chose centering. And so it's adjusting accordingly with my layout. So let's close this and let's get a little more depth into what you can do with this tool. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some examples of how I use the layer tool to design my websites. So let's go to the index page. You'll have recognized this page if you've been to my website. So you'll notice I have a layer here at the top. That's what this blue header section is. This is a layer. And if we double click on it, we can see what I did. I created a layer that has relative horizontal sizing. I've centered the contents, and I've made it a solid sort of dark blue color. That's all there is to it. This is also a layer. This layer contains a responsive menu bar as well as some text. And nothing special about this except that also I've used relative horizontal sizing. Again, the width of these are exactly the page width. I'm using 1200 as my page width. The style here is I've just made it to be a solid color. Now, as we move down my page, I'm also using a layer for this section. This layer is far more complex because I have a lot more objects in it. For one, I've got a background picture. Notice this layer has a little keyboard background to it. What's inside the layer, the objects here are a very large carousel with 25 slides. I've got some text. I've got an image here that is actually a link that opens up some other objects and some other text. If I double click on this layer and show you the attributes of it, again, I use relative horizontal sizing. I'm centering it, but in the style, I chose an image rather than a color. I have an image of that keyboard, which is right here. But I've also done something really special. I've chosen a parallax effect, and there's a video about what that is. But again, it's part of the layer tool. And by choosing parallax, it allows me to have this special effect we'll look at right now. I'm going to preview this page and show you what that does. As we scroll down, you'll notice the image in this layer looks like it's in a different dimension. It scrolls at a different speed. This is called the parallax effect. I've also got this parallax effect in another part of the page down here. You can see right here, that keyboard. It gives it a three-dimensional look, and that's part of the capabilities of a layer. So let's close that. Let's talk a little bit more about what you can do with layers. Here's another layer. And by the way, this page is all designed by stacking layers on top of each other. You don't have to do that, but that's one way to design your web page. And here's another layer that's a little bit different. You'll notice that while this particular container, and it contains, several images and some text, is semi-transparent. You can kind of see the other layer behind it. If you can see some of these blurry objects, that's actually the keyboard picture in the layer behind it. Well, how did we do that? Well, we'll double click on it. And what I did, again, it's relative, it's centered. I've also got it the right width. Everything's the same, except what I've done is I've made it 40% opaque. In other words, it's 60% transparent. So we're kind of seeing some of the layer that's behind it. Another good use of layers is by stacking them and looking through them and creating sort of the special effect. The style here, rather than a solid color, I have a very subtle gradient. There's a white on the bottom and a very subtle off-white on the top. I know it's really, really subtle and you might not see it as well in the video, but I have a gradient color. I could do it with a solid color as well, but I chose a gradient color style for the background and it gave me this effect. So again, as we preview and go look at that, you can see behind this layer, again, it's 60% transparent. So you have that sort of cool effect. I can only do that because I'm utilizing this powerful tool called a layer that does way more than just contain objects. It allows me to create these special effects. Again, so many that I can't cover them all in this video. But just quickly, let me show you, this is just another layer that's a solid green background. Here's another layer with a video and some text and a solid background. Again, there's the layer with the parallax. I've also got some more layers down here. In fact, even this stripe that you see right here that separates this layer from this one, this very narrow stripe, I did not use an image and I did not use a shape. This is in fact a layer that's only 8 pixels high. Now, why would I use an 8 pixel high layer? I'll tell you why. Because layers load much faster than images do. A layer is just some coding. And so in the page code, the HTML, this is not very heavy. This is considered a very fast loading object. If I select this layer, you can see that's in and of itself is its own layer. And if we go down to the page properties and look at how this is set up, it is in fact 1200 pixels wide because that's how wide my page is. I've even got it set up for relative horizontal sizing, and the height is only 8 because it makes just a really nice way to make a stripe. I just pulled it up the page here so you can see that it is its own thing. See? And then we would need to put it back into place before we're done here. Use my arrow keys to get it just right. There we go. And so even that is a layer. So let's move on. I'm going to show you a couple of other things, and I'll do this quickly because I think you get the idea of what I'm saying is it's not a bad idea as you're laying out your website to think in these terms of working with blocks of content called layers. Again, here's my headers, and I make this out of 2 different layers because I want 2 different kinds of background. Also, what I use for layers is sometimes just little boxes of information. Each one of these boxes is a layer. Again, I could have used a shape, except those load slower because they're images. A layer allows me to just drag these objects into it. Each one of these are text objects, and I can choose a background color, a great way to make a box of information. So there's 4 different layers right there. They don't have to fill the page. They can be used as small objects too. Another great use of a layer. Here's another use of a layer. This object right here, you'll see all the way across is a layer. It contains some text and a link. It contains some images that are checkboxes, and that in and of itself is a layer. Then the one below it is another layer of a slightly different color, and I continue to use those. So this page has a lot of layers, but it loads quickly because of that. While these are rollover text objects, they are inside a layer. Again, here's another bar, which I've created by making a layer. In this case, it's 10 pixels tall. Each one of these is layers. You can see that you don't have to use layers that fill the page. Each one of these testimonial boxes is in fact a layer with a different color. And I think I made them semi-transparent. If we double click on them, yeah, I've got the 70% opacity just because I like the way that looks. Not everything has to be inside a layer though. This is just one way to do it. This bit of text is not inside a layer. It's just a text object right here on the page. And in fact, if we go to the testimonials page, you'll see I actually have, again, my layers at the top. This area is not a layer. I just have a carousel object right here with some text in it. I've got a big image right here. None of this is in a layer. It doesn't need to be. It's centered because the page has centering. But as we move down the page, each of these boxes, you guessed it, is a layer. But again, you don't have to do that. For example, I have some text just sitting on the page here that doesn't need to be in a layer. It's out here on its own. So the point is you can mix and match these objects and drag them into place wherever you want them. I like to use layers as containers to organize my site, to keep things straight, and to make things relative. Now, in other layer videos, and we're going to have to finish this video because it's getting long, but in other layer videos, we're going to talk about some of the really, really cool features and modes for layers. So just to give you a little teaser, we've been working just with the default mode of the layer. There are several other things the layer can do, from docking, floating. Use it specifically as a header footer. The modal layer is very powerful. It's great if you're making an opt-in form or a or an autoresponder form. A lot of uses for the modal layer, a panel layer for navigation, and even a sticky layer. I'll show you some examples of that in other videos. But for now, I want you to get used to understanding that the use of a layer will help you organize your content, help it look straight and relative to the rest of the browser size as you're building your websites in 90-second Website Builder.